Is Ukraine too corrupt to join NATO? Escalation management still seems to hold sway over the decisions of allies, including Washington and Berlin. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and comment against the videos. It really does help them perform in YouTube's algorithm. Also, please check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important for us to help Ukrainians to remain resilient at this time. Please also do buy me a coffee if you value the content of this channel. It really does help to keep things going. Today, I'm joined by Jon Sweet and Mark Toth. Jon Sweet is an accomplished intelligence professional who served for 30 years with the defense and intelligence sector as a US Army military intelligence officer. He is now a freelance author, contributor, and columnist for The Hill, The Messenger, Washington Examiner, Kyiv Post, and Fox News. He provides an experienced military perspective on current world events. Mark Toth is a retired economist, historian, and entrepreneur that's lived in US diplomatic and military communities around the world. Mark writes on issues of national security and foreign policy and is a regular contributor to The Hill, BBC, Washington Examiner, Fox Post, Kyiv Post, and The Messenger, amongst others. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you both back. Let's tackle the thing that I mentioned in the intro, which is this extraordinary pronouncement by the State Department that Ukraine is too corrupt to join NATO. What on earth is going on? Let's unpack that statement.
I'll take the first stab at it, Mark. No, that's been a familiar narrative. That's been a narrative we've heard, I think, for the past 10 years. Interesting enough, the Inspector General within the United States, looking at Ukraine and all the money and the weapon systems that have been brought into the country, actually reported that there was not wide-scale corruption within the Ukrainian government. So I just find it interesting that that's the reasoning that the United States falls back on for not bringing Ukraine into the fold, when in fact their own Inspector General has a different outlook. So it seems to me more of the narrative, more of not committing to NATO, more of not sending a message to Russia that we're going to bring them in, knowing that at least prior to the war was definitely a touch point, a sensitive point. Mark?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty astounding because, as John said, there's actually two under the Inspector General. There's two reports. There's one from the State Department. There's one from the Defense Department. So you have two reports. John and I have read them. We've cited them before in articles that we've written to push back on this narrative that somehow Ukraine is terribly corrupt. And it's just not the case. I mean, most of the aid is getting through. We're not seeing widespread corruption. We're not seeing a widespread diversion of U.S. funds, et cetera. Now, they may try to argue that corruption goes beyond, above and beyond what the U.S. provides or the EU provides, is to try to support their position. But I think that's somewhat nonsense, right? It's a country at war. It's a country facing certain exigencies. And certainly at times, you're going to cut corners to get things done. So, in my mind, it is just kind of a political cover excuse, if you will, to find a reason not to allow Ukraine to become part of NATO again, out of all of this escalation fear that we, can't continue to poke, the Putin bear in the stomach. And so I find it disappointing. I also find it ironic. I mean, if you look at it just from an American political standpoint, and not to get too deep into the politics here, but here you have for the last, 6 years, uh, the Republican Party, Trump especially, saying that Ukraine is corrupt. And now you've got the Biden administration basically saying the same thing. After supporting this, after putting that much money into it, it just seems like another own goal, to put it in football terms, that why the Biden administration would go there, why they would use this excuse, makes no sense because, Ukraine has made immense strides in resolving the corruption issues that it has, and it continues to do so. Does it have work to do? Absolutely. But we all do, right? We have a sitting U.S. senator who's charged with crimes right now, yet the Democratic Party isn't demanding that he resign. He's facing criminal charges for being under foreign influence and receiving gold bars. So, I think we've created this, way too high standard for Ukraine, and it's not helpful. And again, I think it's just bad political cover. It's really kind of sophomore level type rationalizations, and we're all it should be, well beyond the graduate level at this point, and how we go about making Ukraine's case. Just madness, Jonathan.
Well, we'll come on to escalation management because it seems to fit a pattern with that. But I just wanted to quickly fire a question at Jonathan. And in talking to many Ukrainians who are involved in introducing systems of transparency around, say, military contracts, around the distribution of lethal aid and so on. Unlike in Iraq and Afghanistan, where there are extraordinary stories of stuff going missing or being sold, off the back of trucks, etc., it would seem that in Ukraine, there are extraordinary strides and innovations being made in terms of procurement systems and transparency, and a real will to track these weapons from delivery right through to the front and usage to their eventual, I would guess, elimination on the front. Could you sort of talk to that point? Because this rarely cuts through the amount of work that's actually being done on the transparency front.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It's using the analogy of the moving goalpost. This is a moving goalpost. It's applying one standard against another standard. So we don't compare what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan to what Ukraine is doing in their survival. Rather, we choose to pick and choose and cherry pick from that. Look, absolutely. The processes that are going on right now, the logistical chains have been established, the throughput of weapons, the accountability of those weapons, and getting those weapons, from the pallet to the foxhole. As I say, logistics is for professionals, and that is exactly what it is. It is a difficult task to move that much equipment. And you're going to have a paper trail. There's a paper trail everywhere. And again, as Mark and I have alluded to, the Inspector General report has indicated that paper trail is solid, that they don't see this vast level of corruption going on. Rather, what they see is a system that was set up by NATO via the U.S. European Command to get those assets into Ukraine where they could be used quickly. Now, there's no bidding. It's a single bidder. They're getting things, and they're getting a lot of things. Some of which they don't necessarily need, but others that they're short of. So the whole process of managing the flow of goods coming into the country is astronomical, and I think Ukraine's done an incredible job. Mark?
Yeah, one point I'd add, kind of a historical exclamation mark. I mean, it's a good thing to remember that the founding, or the primary force behind the founding of NATO, the United States, wrote the book on corruption, wartime corruption. I mean, Harry Truman became vice president under Roosevelt and eventually president because he went after corruption in the U.S. war economy in World War II. Now, that didn't preclude us from founding NATO and being the principal driver behind it. And the corruption that was going on then in the U.S. was much more widespread, much more substantial, and certainly, was not prohibitive for us from taking that lead role. So I think for us to kind of come back and say Ukraine in the middle of an existential war for them is somehow not being clean enough, not being, it's crazy. I mean, if you look to World War II, just as a couple of quick examples, what form did that corruption take? It was corrupt deals with the mob. It was corrupt deals with the union dock workers when it became important to get things offloaded, and Roosevelt and his administration were being blackmailed. I mean, so, there's a history of corruption in war, and it's unfortunate and it should be stamped out. But it seems to me that if you step back and you try to be objective about it, the U.S. through the Inspector General's office, through the Pentagon itself, and the paper trails and the efforts that it makes, as well as the State Department in terms of the aid that it dispenses, I think we've done a remarkable job, as has Ukraine on the flip side of it, in terms of receiving it. And we see, just one last quick point here. We see how Russia tries to use this corruption angle to create even additional disinformation. For instance, Twitter was ablaze yesterday. There's an account by the name of Jackson Hinkle that was, accusing the First Lady of Ukraine of buying a Bugatti in Paris. But, quick spotting people said, wait, there's no French VAT on that. The address is wrong. The spelling of the city is wrong. And Bugatti, or at least the entity that owns that dealership, has now sued Jackson Hinkle over it for, making essentially a false allegation. But Hinkle is someone that, by his own admission, has close ties with Russia. He's been in Russia. He claims to be at the United Nations today as we film this, basically speaking about how great Russia is and how bad the West is. So I just don't see any of this being helpful to the Ukraine's war effort. And I really do view it, just to reemphasize, it's an own goal, and I don't get it.
It's let's link it to potentially to an ongoing set of communications, attitude, strategies which are discernible, and that is escalation management. It is the lack of projecting will, the lack of projecting deterrence for fear. And that fear could be a number of things. It could be a Russian collapse. It could be Russia's use of tactical nuclear weapons. But it seems we are constantly limiting our actions and modulating our language through fear of Russia and what it might do.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And Mark and I termed it escalation paralysis, but that's what it is. It's fear of the unknown. But at some point you have to mitigate that fear. You have to build programs or processes that mitigate that fear or that potential escalation to allow you to conduct your mission. And I think that's the one thing that's missing. And we talk about this all the time is what is the strategy? What is the outcome? What is the end state for Ukraine? It's not clear. It's not clear if they want Ukraine to win. I mean, I think they want Ukraine to win, but everyone's skipping that step and looking 10 years down the road. 10 years down the road doesn't matter if you don't win the next 6 months. So a winning strategy and then the execution of that winning strategy and supplying that winning strategy and getting behind that winning strategy, that changes the outcome. Right now, we're stuck in this reaction mode. As I've told Mark and other folks in the Army, we use a process called action, reaction, counteraction, where we're wargaming outcomes. And we are in a persistent mode of reaction. Everything is a reaction. And then we base our next action based upon the Russia action. And typically the Russian reaction is escalatory or threats of escalatory, whether it's nuclear weapons or, like you said, maybe it's territorial gains outside of Russia, like in the Sahel, but in the Sudan or in Libya, or maybe it's helping Iran in its battle against Israel and the United States in the Middle East. A wider conflict generally is one of the escalation issues that the West deals with. So I would really like to see a strategy to win, not the words to win, because the administration has used those words periodically, but they never back those words up. They say we want to win, and then in the next sentence, they're restricting Ukraine's ability to fire at targets across the border. So it's very frustrating how that goalpost continues to move.
Yeah, I'd point out that I think when you look at the escalation paralysis that we see, there's really two key aspects to consider. One is one that General Ben Hodges raised early in the war, is that you can't control what you can't control, right? It's a lot of hubris to think that the United States or NATO is somehow going to control whether Putin stays in power. And he could die of a heart attack. He could be 86th in a coup. He could be arrested, toppled, whatever. We can't control that, right? Russia could fall apart tomorrow, and we'd be faced with all those escalation fears that are preventing us from going for the win in Ukraine. So, I think that's some perspective that, and from a man who's long thought about how to fight against Russia should, they attack Western Europe. Yeah, I think that's one angle. But I think too, we've got some historical perspective here. We've watched Russia, albeit as the Soviet Union, fall about before. We've seen what has happened when that country falls apart. It didn't go crazy. Nukes weren't released. I know there was fear that there were, suitcase nukes all over the place. None of that turned out to be true. It was able to collapse. And I think it's important to understand how that collapsed in mass, but not necessarily in terms of its power base. The KGB simply reinvented itself as the FSB and several other intel agencies. They remain the kingmakers. They remain the ones in control. There's a history going all the way back to Stalin, if you look at Russian history, of where the military has been kept intentionally weak. And we've seen that play out again. I mean, look at how many generals have been purged over the course of this war, right? There's not a whole lot of of strength that is, that the Ministry of Defense is able to project in terms of protecting its own. I mean, Putin one after the other is fired, imprisoned, charged, or whatever. Had them fall out of buildings, etc. The guy that was in charge of the tank factory, was killed the day before Putin was supposed to show up at it. So, I think when you look in totality, nothing much is going to change if Putin does go, because that KS, that former KGB, which is now the FSB, they're still going to remain. They're still going to dictate who becomes that next leader, and you're going to pretty much, in my opinion, and again, this is just me putting on my forecast hat here. I think you'll see the country pretty much stay the same. I don't know that a whole lot changes. So, from our standpoint, from advocating strategies to get beyond this escalation paralysis that we're gripped by, we got to stop thinking that way, right? We need to start going for wins. Something that John and I have been, focused on, something that we're writing about currently is it's time to start putting wins on the board. And if you're the US, I mean, right now, and if you're NATO, we have other partners, other allies that are willing to put those wins on the board for us. Ukraine is screaming to give us a win. Israel is screaming to give us a win, not just in, against Hamas or Hezbollah, but potentially against Iran and their nuclear program as well. It's just kind of madness. So, the escalation management is basically us managing ourselves into a corner, in my opinion. And in my view, last point I'll make here, it's Jake Sullivan who's maneuvered us into that corner.
And I think what comes across from the writings that you both produce is that it's very much grounded in strategy, but there's also a moral point of view. What you're advocating for is Ukrainian victory because it is the right thing, because Ukrainians should not be granted agency, but we should recognize that they have agency. It seems that in the Sullivan mode of thinking, and there are many, I think, in dabble in geopolitics and so on, they tend to look at this as some grand game of chess. They deny Ukraine agency. They look at the country as a sort of corridor or a chess piece, not an entity in itself that has any kind of right to exercise over its own future. That to me talks about a complete moral vacuum in foreign policy, that sort of chessboard mentality. Could that also be behind or be influencing this horrendous, I call it escalation appeasement. I go one step further. Could that sort of disjointed or mode of thinking be also feeding into this?
Absolutely. I agree. And I agree. I think that's a great observation, Jonathan. It's a bit of that, but the other piece is, and Mark and I have talked about this on other fronts, is what is the administration protecting by not going after Russia or letting Ukraine go after Russia, by not letting Israel go after Iran? What are they protecting? What is their end state? And we don't know their end state because, quite frankly, their national security strategy doesn't provide an end state. It's a well-written document. Okay, it's very academic. It would be a great master's thesis, but there's no substance behind it, and there's nothing backing it up. So absolutely, both countries are being used for the benefit of others. Call it what you want. I mean, the strategy at the beginning of the war, at least as it was articulated by the Secretary of Defense and also the Secretary of State, ultimately was weaken Russia. And that was repeated over and over and over. And 31 months later, we are still in the process of weakening Russia, not defeating Russia, weakening Russia. So we deny them the tools they need to take it the extra step to win. And it's the same. And Mark and I wrote an article in The Hill last week about what Israel's doing in the Middle East, how they're fighting three fronts. I mean, they're fighting Hamas, they're fighting Hezbollah, and they're taking on Iran all at the same time. But their strategy is an isolation type of strategy where they're isolating Hamas in the direct firefight, while at the same time holding Hezbollah in a position while maintaining situational awareness of what Iran's doing on its nuclear program. So as they defeat Hamas, they will lift and shift to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah realizes that, and Iran also realizes that the next step to Iran is Hezbollah. And Israel has definitely sent messages to Iran by striking airfields near their underground nuclear facilities. So Iran got the message of the capabilities that Israel has, and what Israel's end state is that they're not going to be a nuclear capable country. So it's the playbook needs to be widened. It can't just be defend, and that's unfortunately the loop that this administration puts us in. It's defend, and it's look after the U.S. interests versus the interests of our allies.
Yeah, I'd add kind of like at a high altitude level, I think what we're seeing here, and I do agree, Jonathan, that, characterizing it as escalation appeasement is a good way to look at it. That's kind of the end result. But I wonder if that's the initial cause. I think what that real cause is that uh, Biden's White House, especially in terms of Jake Sullivan, still doesn't get it that the world turned upside down on February 22nd, 2022. And he's still trying to operate under an old paradigm that somehow the United Nations, other instruments of diplomacy, et cetera, can lead to negotiated settlements. He doesn't understand the scale, the magnitude, the scope, all of that, of what Russia and increasingly China are doing and utilizing as well. What John and I have called their arsenal of evil allies, North Korea and Iran. They don't realize what's coming at them. And so they keep trying to act as though that world still exists, and it doesn't. And so in their minds, I suspect, and again, this is just me trying to psychoanalyze Jake Sullivan, if you will. I suspect he would argue that, all I'm trying to do is to ratchet this down. I can make a deal with these guys. We can buy them off. We can do a rinse and repeat with Iran and give them more billions. And yet he doesn't see what they're doing with all of this. He doesn't see what they are doing with time and space. I mean, look around the world. What has Putin done since he began his invasion in Ukraine? He's expanded the playing field. He's gone into, the Sahel, which we'll get to later, based on the things that you said you wanted to talk about. He's expanded it. China as well is expanding. They're using this time to do it. Iran certainly has, right? They're playing a deep game. We just wrote an article 2 weeks ago in the Hill, echoing one that we'd written for the New York Post in New York City, saying that, hey, Biden is getting sidetracked here. He's missing that, by being so caught up in Hamas and in Hezbollah, he's missing that Tehran is marching along with his nuclear program. They built a second enrichment facility at Natanz, the same place that Israel, took out the air defense batteries, the warning sign. They've got a second one. So, I mean, there's centrifuge capacity to enrich uranium. It's accelerating, it's exponential. And, the latest estimates are, in terms of mass, they've got enough mass for 13 bombs, and it would only take them 4 days to enrich enough uranium to do that. So, we're running out of time. I mean, they still have to figure out testing. They still have to figure out to make sure that they can deliver nukes, but they're just too close. And so, from my standpoint, the White House needs to wake up and realize it's no longer 2022. It's 2024. The world has changed. It's turned upside down, and it's about time that our strategy caught up with it, but it hasn't yet.
And there's a point there which Jonathan made that I'd like to sort of launch into, and that is this idea of weakening Russia being the strategy, but it ignores a fundamental biological principle that if you don't kill a pathogen, but simply weaken it, it can mutate and it becomes more virulent and more lethal. And to use that simple analogy, it seems that Russia is doing exactly that, both externally and internally. It is becoming a much more toxic and malignant and autocratic society, but also it seems to be projecting its willingness to export the sort of terror that is unleashed on its own people. We see acts of sabotage across Europe. We see the expansion in the Sahel. We see this partnership with North Korea and the potential for multiple battalions of North Korean troops and engineers to be fighting on the territory of Europe, something which a few years ago would have been inconceivable. By tolerating and enabling Russia, we seem to be making things far, far worse.
Oh, absolutely. And Mark and I have written about that pretty extensively too, is that, de-escalation has only led to escalation. It only leads to the next step. And Russia's in a survival mode. The one thing that the Russian military is failing to do right now is achieve wins on the battlefield. However, the FSB in its disinformation campaign has been very successful in destabilizing the Sahel in Western Africa. Mercenary groups, former mercenary groups like Wagner, were able to unseat the government in the Sudan. Russia now has a port in the Red Sea. Russia now has a port in Libya. So theoretically, Russia could shut down the Western Med and the Eastern Med and lock the Mediterranean up, theoretically. But that disinformation campaign and that ability to do that and of course, like you said, the sabotage, it's there. It's one of the things the FSB is very good at, and they're executing that mission successfully. No, so absolutely, it just gets, from that perspective, it gets stronger. On the battlefield, though, they seem to just be throwing more bodies into the mix. It doesn't matter if they're Russian or ethnic Russian or foreign fighters or prison. They don't care. Get them in a uniform, get them to the front line. There was a tweet the other day that I saw that somebody had identified a weapon that dated back to 1892 that they saw on the battlefield, a personal firearm. And they're saying that's what it's come down to. They're pulling weapons out of the inventory and giving them to soldiers that were used, in World War I. So mass, it's always mass with them. But one of the analogies that we've used in the past is letting your adversary stick around into the fourth quarter. So to use a sports analogy, when you can take them out in the first half, why do you let them stick around to the fourth quarter so they can take that game-winning shot with 2 seconds remaining? And that's kind of what we're doing with Russia. We're just letting them hang around, and they figure out ways to disrupt and to achieve victories in other ways that has a global impact. So no, I agree absolutely with you, Jonathan. Mark?
Yeah, no, I concur. I think John said that well. Nothing really to add there.
Well, let's get to the how. If we are going to push back against Russia, if we are going to develop a deterrent policy that actually works and does not exude weakness, and we've already talked at length about how the Russian elite interprets as weakness, words are weakness, willing to negotiate is weakness, anything except exerting extreme strength and pushing back is interpreted as weakness. What is there coming up in the summer that potentially will start to project this? Before we hit record, we started talking about F-16s and so on, but we also know that there are hundreds of Bradleys sitting in the desert, some of which could be cannibalized for parts, some of which, many hundreds potentially, could be used as active armor for the Ukrainians. And they've shown themselves extraordinarily adept at adapting to new equipment and evolving new tactics, which the people who designed this equipment hadn't even envisaged for them. What more should we be doing?
Yeah, let me, I'll
Go ahead,
let
Mark.
John in a second here, answer the military side of that equation. I'll say from a strategy standpoint, again, going back to high altitude, is that we need, the most effective thing that can work against Russia is simply saying we are going to win and that Ukraine is going to win. I mean, making it clear, making it an issue of national security, an issue that you bring before the American people and saying, look, this cannot stand. Biden had that inclination, that first speech that he gave in Warsaw back towards the beginning of the war, he made it clear that Putin, shouldn't stay. Now he's since backed off of that as his advisors caught up to him. But his inclination was right. He knew that this was changing, or game changing in terms of what had happened, but since has been walked back by his advisors. So, I would argue that the biggest thing that we could be doing is simply, getting out of this playing for ties and focusing on winning and saying that we're going to win. That's one thing that Churchill and that Roosevelt did masterfully during World War I at the outset, even before it was clear that we could win, right? They said we were going to win, and they made that a clear articulation of strategy. We don't have that yet. We don't have them admitting fully the scale of this, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and we don't have them, saying, "Up, let's step back. We need to rewrite our plan so that we can take into account all of these growing threats that are facing not just Washington, but Brussels too, as well as the United Kingdom, and being able to do them." Now, in terms of what can actually go onto the battlefield, I think John is a little bit better position to talk about that than myself. John?
Yeah, I think it begins with what we already talked about, Jonathan. It begins with a plan. Now, look, I'm sure there's a plan somewhere. It's just not being shared, obviously, with the media. But a plan, and a plan is articulated to the American people so you can get support behind it from an American base, and then also to the base of the Europeans also to understand that there's a plan to win, that there's an end state. What we're seeing now, obviously, is the introduction, or at least reports of the introduction of F-16 aircraft into Ukraine. We haven't seen them yet, but what we have seen are the condition setting that's going on to facilitate the use of those F-16s. We're seeing S-300s, S-400s, allegedly the S-500 that was recently deployed to Crimea being destroyed. And what that's doing is open up air corridors for future strikes to get those F-16s in, to start interdicting troop formations, to start interdicting weapon systems. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of that as far as condition setting. We may even see some additional sand bushes in which Patriot systems will move forward to strike out the eyes of Russian intelligence services, particularly with their surveillance aircraft. We may see some of that. We're going to see a lot of strikes against radars and early warning radars and terminal guidance radars. And I think we're going to start seeing more strikes against Russian artillery. That's all condition setting, and that's I think what we're going to see the next couple of months is we're going to start seeing more deliberate targeting of those systems. But equally as important, though, as you go after those strategic targets, is the interdiction of Russian forces, and we've seen that recently when we get to the Kharkiv region, in which Ukraine came back and said, "Look, we can see them across the border, but we can't strike them." Those restrictions were lifted, and those targets were hit, and it's forced the Russian forces to move back 20, 50, 70 kilometers. But then, then we reversed course and we came back and said, you can't use ATACMS to strike beyond 100 kilometers. Okay, but again, it's that moving goalpost. It's that just enough, not enough to win, but just enough to survive. In order to defeat Russia in Ukraine, you have to defeat their ability to sustain combat operations. And that means you have to defeat their infantry as they mass and as they come across the border. Then you have to defeat their artillery, which is the number one casualty producing mechanism that the Russians have. They are going to mass fires to support their infantry. They're doing a very effective job in destroying tanks and BMPs. And they are doing an effective job of killing Russians in Ukraine, but not necessarily defeating them as they mass in their assembly areas. So I think we're going to have to see that. And we're going to see the isolation of Crimea sometime this summer, too. And by the isolation of Crimea, that means possibly taking down the Kerch Strait Bridge, and then other means in which the Russians were able to resupply their forces in Crimea. And making that unattainable and then opening that up. I think there was a report yesterday that said that that the United States lifted restrictions against ATACMS use in the Crimea Peninsula also. So we're going to start seeing that occur, making it untenable for future operations. But right now, Ukraine is in the same position they were about 18 months ago, which is where they're building combat power in one area, and then in another area, they're defending critical terrain as they build that combat power for future operations. But you're right. Eventually, there's going to have to be maneuver on the ground, and it's going to have to be combined arms operation, which means they're going to have that close air support. They're going to have those Bradleys and those tanks, and they're going to have artillery. And we're starting to see the shells come in from the Czech Republic. But it's going to take time and strategic patience, which many don't have at certain levels of governance. But I do believe that Ukraine has a plan, and I think we ought to be behind it in full force and give them the munitions that they need, the kitchen sink.
I couldn't.
I'd quickly add
more.
there, just one point on that. Russia still is on the initiative, right? They're still in and around Kupiansk. They're still, pushing in and around Kharkiv. They're probing, as John has pointed out, News Times and private conversations to me all along that battlefront, looking for openings, looking ways to probe in. But it's coming at a cost, right? It's not an initiative that the U.S. Army would be fighting. It's a meat grinder initiative. And it's costing them a lot of troops, a lot of casualties, a lot of equipment loss. And so I think what we need to be positioned for, the things that we can do to change this paradigm is to be ready for Ukraine to take advantage of that opportunity. At some point, that initiative will go back on the defensive if it doesn't break through, and it's not likely that it will. And so, I think we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can so that Ukraine can maximize when they're able to go, if they can, on the counteroffensive. John, do you have any other thoughts on that? Because that's one thing I know you and I have talked about is always being ready to exploit opportunities on the battlefield once they present themselves.
Yeah, and opportunities do present themselves, but it's all a matter of who can react the quickest. And when you're in a defensive position and you're limited in your ability to maneuver, you don't have that. Right now, Russia has the agility. Russia has and continues to be the aggressor on the battlefield, at least on the ground. And they are probing. They are constantly looking for openings. They're constantly pressuring Ukrainian defenses because they know that Ukraine's a mile wide and an inch deep, and they're just looking for that 1 inch that they can exploit. But Ukraine's been very successful and continues to be successful, obviously, in defeating those assaults, and they are numerous every day. And British intelligence tells us that upwards to 1,000 Russian soldiers are either killed or wounded every day. We're seeing elite formations within the Russian military be decimated. We saw just recently one of the airborne units that was involved in the Kharkiv offensive was destroyed. I mean, and percentage-wise, I mean, destroyed doesn't mean to the last man, but destroyed to the point where it's not combat effective. And I've argued this before, that just because it's an airborne unit and it's labeled as elite doesn't mean that 31 months after the start of the war, that's the same unit that started the fight. All those guys are dead, seriously wounded. The leadership, the experience, all gone. It's been replaced with other Russian. Now, they may be regular army that have been put on a uniform and a patch, but they're no longer elite. And that's demonstrated just by the fact that they were decimated just a month ago. So, no, Ukraine's been very successful at defending Ukraine. They've given some terrain and a mobile defense in order to maintain their strength. But at some point, in order to win, they have to move forward. And to move forward means you have to shut down. You have to shut down their ability to sustain operations. And you have to sustain, and you have to create space between the front line and the border. If you can prevent Russia from getting to the border, from crossing the border, and you can push and you create that space, once you get past that first defensive belt into that second defensive belt, there's nothing between you and the border if you're allowed to interdict those forces before they arrive. So interdiction's key. Taking down those air defense assets, radars, opening up air corridors, that's going to be the key to winning later this summer, is the close air support. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the piece. It is rather a larger piece of a combined arms effort.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that Putin earlier in the year had a major reshuffle where Shoigu and Patrushev were moved aside, and this guy, Belousov, a sort of Soviet-era economist, was put in place. And amongst Z patriots and amongst the media, it was touted as, well, he's going to change the system, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. That always seemed rather unrealistic. But what he may have done is been put in place to give Putin a better idea of the reality on the ground, the reality in the army, and an assessment of how much resource actually can be requisitioned from the economy. That is where what I think is going on here. So Putin may be better informed about what's going on. It may mean that he's placing less of his chips down on the idea of winning on the battlefield, more on the idea of winning through Western weakness, through Western hesitancy, more based on taking out Ukrainian energy infrastructure, more on trying to weaponize information in our political systems. And you can imagine, we don't even have to imagine, I think he's already doing this, utilizing, say, the weakness of Biden in the presidential election, using the division between left and right in your system, and the implosion of the Tory party in this country. We can see with reform coming up, there is certainly, I wouldn't be surprised if the Kremlin isn't pouring petrol on the flames, because this is his best chance of winning, not the battlefield. I'd be fascinated to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I think if you look at, again, at high altitude, I have to repeat myself, Putin has tried to win what he can't win on the battlefield in a variety of ways. He's tried to do that through the disinformation war. He's tried to do that through nuclear threats. He's tried to do that by intimidating small countries, be it the Baltic states or whatever, taking away the buoys that demarcate the border there with Lithuania and the like. He's tried a lot of different angles to get to a victory, but he hasn't been able to get any of them to work, and that's a good thing. But still, he tries. And so, in terms of putting an economics guy in, I think you have to look at it kind of at a multi-layered level. The first level that I would look at is to say, remember that Putin has taken his country to what, the Telegraph, I believe, in your country described as a permanent war footing. So that is a lot of rubles, worthless as they are, going into the system that need to be managed. And that creates competing demands on industry, creates competing demands on natural resources. And someone has to sort that all out. And that becomes more of an economist issue, the logistics, if you will, of the economy, right? We talk about logistics winning on the battlefield and in terms of the military, but there's a logistics in terms of how money gets spent. And so I think a lot of that is recognizing that I'm about to pump more money into this. And Putin's got to know it's a system he set up. He's got to realize that part of the reason why his forces have performed so poorly was all the corruption and graft today that the defense ministry was able to siphon off in different pet projects. And so I think part of it was simply to say, okay, now that I'm going to commit even more of the country's resources, economic resources, to being on this permanent war footing, because I think he's thinking multifold. He's not just thinking in terms of Ukraine, but ultimately how he reconstitutes his force to be a threat in the eventual, in the future to NATO, right? So I mean, there's two things going on there, and I think that's the primary purpose of him. I would be a little bit leery. I'd be interested to see what John thinks here. I'd be a little bit leery of just assuming, though, that Putin is conceding anything. This is a guy that's proven he'll take his wins when he has them, and then he goes back and tries again. And so I'd be awfully careful of thinking that somehow, by replacing his defense minister, that it's signaling that he's looking to, lose in the long run. He might be willing to negotiate in the short run. He might be willing to look at alternatives about how to win. But I think overall his goal is going to remain the same. I don't see anything out of him that says, I'm going to give up this campaign. I mean, look, in many ways, look at how he humiliated himself by going to North Korea. And think about that. A Soviet premier having done something the same, he'd want to kind of arrive as a king. He came on bended knee, begging for artillery shells and the like. So and just look at by the same token with how he's prostrating himself with China. That's a role reversal from what Stalin and then subsequently Khrushchev represented. In the 1950s and 60s with Russia being the kingmakers and China, basically trying to hang on and trying to learn from them, asking for nuclear weapons, but being denied them. That Khrushchev didn't want them to get that. And now you have the reversal of it. It's Russia that's desperate for Chinese aid. So in my mind, I think I would look at this more from the standpoint that Putin is still looking for a way to win. And this is just the next step in that process, even if it means taking an operational pause in Ukraine, even if it means negotiating. But if you really think about it, my last point here is that I haven't seen anything in what he's offered in negotiations that really suggests he's serious about it. He keeps, offering non-starters to Ukraine. So it's kind of like, I think that's lip service. I think some of that's geared towards the domestic audience. Look, I'm trying. I need you to sacrifice more. I'm going to control more of the economy, but I just don't see it yet. I think he's still fully committed to this. John, do you have a different view?
No, my view is consistent, Mark. From a Ukrainian perspective, from a Western perspective, winning solves this. Winning takes care of this problem. And again, let's define win, because when people say win, they don't necessarily tell you what it means. From my perspective, winning means that Ukraine has reestablished their territory. The Russian forces are out of Ukraine, they're out of Crimea, and those territorial boundaries have been replicated. So that's winning. The second part of winning then is ensuring that Russia can't do that again. Part of that obviously is inclusion into NATO and the possibility of NATO bases and NATO forces being stationed there to help defend Ukraine from future attacks. But to get to Mark's point, Putin has no designs to stop. I mean, and he's told us that. If you listen to Russian radio, Russian television, the propagandists, they're telling you the end state is the complete destruction of Ukraine, its language, its culture, its people. They're gone. He's already expressed interest. I mean, in his writings of reestablishing, getting the band back together, bringing the Baltic states back in, bringing Poland back in. They're all aware of that, and they're all very conscious of that. Those Eastern European countries remember. They were subjugated at one time, and they have no intent of ever being subjugated again. So I think there's a bit of a divide between the Eastern NATO countries and the Western NATO countries on what when means and how to go about doing it. Yeah, he's shifted tactics with a new defense minister. He realizes that what has been occurring on the battlefield is not working. But I also think he realizes that he has more capability that he can reach back into as far as personnel. He can continue to bring weight on the battlefield as far as mass and infantry. He has the capability of mobilizing and conscripting soldiers. And I think he's going to start getting into the business of mass production of weapons. But mass producing T-90s isn't going to be effective because he doesn't have the soldiers that can operate those T-90s. Okay, he's lost that capability. So I think you may see some of the older brands or simpler brands of tanks being introduced in the form of mass. I mean, we saw this during the Second World War with the T-34s. It was just who could produce more. Same thing with the Sherman tanks. The Sherman and T-34 were inferior to the Panzer, but nonetheless, quantity beat quality at the end of the day. And I think that's what he's looking for is quantity, thinking that he can overrun Ukraine to some extent, and to keep relentless pressure on the West and driving the West to a negotiation table. But he has no desire. I don't think if you look at Putin and his track record of honoring ceasefires or peace agreements, I think he's 0 for 4, 0 for 5. He's not going to honor that. That's the ability to buy time, to reconstitute, to reorganize, to look at lessons learned, to rebuild, and then to back it up and do it again. So let's not fool ourselves. His end state remains the same as it was when he came across the border on 22 February.
Yeah, Jonathan, if I could real quickly add on to that, because it goes to a point that you raised in your original question, is that, and John already kind of gave the answer here. I would look at the disinformation campaigns that you're seeing, the willingness to kind of enter the fray, whether it's UK politics or, clearly right now we're undergoing a crisis here in the US because of President Biden's debate performance, right? Questions about whether or not he's diminished or whether he's capable of continuing in the job, et cetera. All of those things are going on. And so Putin uses those opportunities to buy time, as John was pointing out. And I think that's the best way to kind of look at that, is that, they're trying to weaponize that, and they have all along. And so definitely in terms of whatever strife comes out of the result of the election in the UK, come tomorrow, right? I believe it's tomorrow. That you'll probably see trying to divide Tories against Labour and the like in that fallout. I think we're likely to start seeing that, not just in terms of Republicans versus Democrats right now, but there's a great divide right now, even inside the Democratic Party, that I would suspect and anticipate Putin to try to start affecting that debate and causing division. I fully expect that the social media sphere will get inundated with Russian bots and trolls trying to get one faction of Democrats to attack the other, and people might not realize it. So it's definitely something to guard against, but I think it's also important to understand the intent behind it. It's not only just to buy division, which is what it's buying, but it's also to buy time.
dare I say it, to drop some names there, you have a rather toxic Kennedy that's in the fray. We have someone called Nigel Farage, who has an uncanny ability to amplify and repeat Kremlin talking points. But we probably shouldn't sort of get into that through a risk of being sued. They're quite litigious, some of these people. The last area I want to focus on is perhaps the bigger chess game. And it's not really chess, it's not that complex. But if we look at Orban, who turned up in Kyiv this week, he clearly has the manner and bearing of a Kremlin poodle. You know, he's a minor figure who is conveying messages, trying to put a certain agenda across. If we look, though, at the sort of dynamic within Russia, you know, extreme sort of punitive justice system, where you have someone like Kadyrov, who for many years was used as Putin's pit bull, the kind of rabid dog that was always there as a threat, that if you cross Putin, well, this thing could be unleashed on you. And that's been very effective at keeping many of the Russian elites in check. Is it perhaps the case now that we are seeing Putin becoming the rabid attack dog of China, that is able to coercively control and manipulate us by pointing at this and going like, well, you better do what we say, or, you know, this mad frothing dog, Putin and Russia, well, you know, we can perhaps control them a little bit for you, or we can, you know, let them do their thing.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. In the past, Putin's been able to put people in front of him as what you say, as the unstable one, the unrational actor, and then Putin comes in to fix things, right? But now Putin's the fixer because, quite frankly, he's gotten rid of all those folks, and there's no one to turn to. He's lost his Wagner group, you know, Prigozhin. He's lost that capability of reaching out and hitting you hard. Now he still has that capability within the FSB, and their track record's pretty efficient in their ability to take out folks both within Russia but also worldwide. Yeah, so I think sometimes when you hide behind the irrational actor, you get more attention. People are more cautious of you. I'm not sure China plays Russia that way. I think China plays Russia to a point of, to the same effect, I think, at some levels that the U.S. does when we talk about weakening Russia. I think China's okay with weakening Russia as well. I think China, at least economically, sees opportunities globally that they can reach into without the obstruction of Russia, regardless of if they're members of BRICS. So I do think a weakened Russia helps China to some degree, but particularly open up the opportunities in Western Europe, and Mark can talk much more on the economic aspects of all that. But no, I think you bring up a great point, Jonathan, and obviously something we should be looking more at. Mark?
Yeah, you know, my perspective of China is, you know, you kind of have to look at it historically. You go back to the 1950s. What really brought China and Russia together initially was this shared ideology, communism. That doesn't exist anymore. You know, Putin has eschewed that. He's not a communist. You know, he's more of a mobster. He sees himself, you know, that way from an economic standpoint. Whereas China continues to be and still very much believes in communism, their version of it, the capitalistic version of it. So before ideology kind of defined the relationship as well as the conflict between the two, because you had this competing role in global politics as to who was the more pure communist entity, and that led to historically a lot of the disagreements between Mao and Russia, ultimately to the point where, you know, there was a break. There was a point where they were attacking each other. They were trying to seize territory, and disputes over India and stuff like that. So, you know, it definitely has changed. And I think some people forget, but it's important to remember that Xi Jinping, you know, the president of China's father, was a key diplomat during Mao's reign that was responsible for much of managing the relationship with Stalin and subsequent Soviet leaders. So he was in Moscow quite a bit. And so you've got, and it was kind of a love-hate relationship. And so you've got Xi having learned from that yes, Russia is something that can be used, but it's also something to be watched. So, I'm not sure whether or not they view Putin as their pit bull, if you will, but I think they view him as someone that they can exploit. And I do think if we step back and we look at how China viewed this war at the beginning versus how they probably view it now, it's changed. At the very beginning, I think they thought it was problematic, troublesome. I mean, a huge part of China's game plan has been, the Belt Road Initiative, right? And a key part of that has been the European China Expressway, the railway. That goes through Ukraine. That goes through Belarus. Two areas that now are caught up in this conflict. So China is kind of boxed out a huge commitment, that ability to transit those things. And it's kind of created a disproportionate strength, ironically, for Poland, because 90% of all that railway traffic that China envisioned, as trade going into Europe goes through Poland. It either transits Poland or it ends up in Poland. And so there's a bottleneck there. So to the extent that this conflict continues, economically it hurts China in the long run. So, you got to kind of weigh that into thinking, how do they want to play Putin? Now, it could be that their calculus is, okay, we're going to have to take the economic hit, but because of problems in the West, because of disintegration in the West, because you've got, the rise of right-wing parties in the West, they may view it as just opportunity to say, okay, Putin for now serves a useful purpose, and that maybe we accelerate our own time frame when it comes to Taiwan and what we want to do in terms of exerting our influence in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we see them continuing unabated, going after Filipino shipping in the South China Seas and the like. So, kind of put a wrap on this and see if John has any follow-ups on it. I would caution that they view him as his lapdog, as maybe potentially more as just a useful idiot right now. That he was problematic to begin with. He started as a Mussolini, but now he's they found some value, figured out how to exploit him. John, do you have any different thinking?
No, I think that echoes exactly what I said. I think Russia's a useful tool. It's helping China achieve their goals. Everything you mentioned about the Pacific, again, that's messaging at one level, but that's also testing the alliances in the South Pacific too, to see how much they can get away with. While things are going on in Eastern Europe, and while other activities are going on in Africa and in the Middle East. Remember, China is very active in East Africa, whereas Russia is very active in West Africa, and also projecting down towards South Africa. So it's a continent of resources that both are competing for, particularly in green energy. It's something I think often we miss. From a U.S. perspective, we get caught up in ideology, we get caught up in religion, but we forget what's underneath the surface and how it's being taken and used later against us.
Yeah, and just real quickly, and some of that, is Jonathan, is growing into the Mideast. I mean, clearly we've seen that with China and what they're trying to do with Iran. But just recently, there's been reporting that Chinese technology was used by Hamas to build their tunnel systems. So, they're reaching out in different ways. They're expanding, and that would tie in, whether ultimately it's convincing Iran to utilize the Houthis. That could all play into, Chinese strategic designs on the Horn of Africa to Djibouti, threatening U.S. forces there and the like. So they're trying to create pressure points, and they are growing them. But and that would obviously be in conflict with Russia, the kind of views that it should be kind of the kingmaker or the playmaker, if you will, when it comes to the Mideast. What they're doing in Syria, what they've tried to do in terms of growing their relationship with Iran, and then just the support that we saw coming out of Russia for what Hamas did on October 7th.
Well, that maybe cues us up for the next potential conversation, and that is looking at the tentacles that are emerging, not just, as you say, sort of political, ideological, but that fight for resources, influence, so on. We've done a couple of episodes on the channel about Wagner in Africa, and it's extraordinary how that works and how Wagner sustains itself while also fulfilling Russia's agenda, which is the destruction of civic society, the destruction of rule of law, and the expansion of autocracy, which is an environment in which Russia thrives, whereas a rule of law medium is one where, of course, its business model falls apart, doesn't work. That cues up potentially the next conversation. I say on behalf of the audience, we're always hugely grateful to you both for coming and joining on the channel. I strongly encourage people to read the fantastic articles. You guys are extraordinarily prodigious, but certainly there's no sacrifice of quality, and what you're writing about is absolutely essential. We'll put a couple of links to your most recent articles in this. I also strongly recommend people tune into the Maria Report, where you now have a weekly segment on Tuesday. I think guess afternoon your time. That'll be sort of evening Tuesday UK time. Do tune in. It's absolutely essential listening. But Mark and Jonathan, thank you so much.
Hey, thank
Always
you,
a
Jonathan.
pleasure, and look forward to
Yeah,
coming
always
back.
a
That'd be a
pleasure.
great topic.